really excited to be here today to talk about um, some topics that we've really been talking about quite a bit in the marketing community, not only because it changes every day, but because the solutions also change every day. And really excited to be here with a company that's doing it right. Um, so I'd like to kick it off and just start and ask Nicole a question, and also have everyone just introduce a little bit more about their role and what they do at Kellogg, just starting off with some of the information. So, Nicole, when do you predict cookies will actually go away for good? Because we've been fooled before. And what are you doing to get ahead of the cookies at Kellogg,
Yeah,
and a little bit about your role and background, and why you're the person to lead this off?
yeah, absolutely. It's really great to be here. Thanks to the Brand Innovators team for welcoming myself and my team. So I'm Nicole Vinson. I lead a lot of our global marketing capability and the overall marketing transformation strategy in partnership with the many folks from my team that are on today's call. And so I'll have the rest of the team introduce themselves, but you've got a nice flavor of the team who is leading everything from advanced analytics to how we're evolving our measurement and our audience strategy, and then really how are we driving forward our first and third party data strategy to really combat the overall deprecation of the cookie. So really excited to be here today. So if I think about what's happening right now, obviously I was just on a call earlier with some of our agency partners and looking at 2024 is when I guess now the new date is that we are going to deprecate the cookie. But ultimately, this is really imminent. It's happening now. And really brands and marketers really need to be addressing sort of how they're going to tackle this quickly. Because, driving change in your organization can take time. And if I think about our journey here at Kellogg, we're really starting to make a ton of investments in growing our first party data set, not only in the US, but across the globe, and really building and strengthening those third party data partnerships and figuring out who are the right partners, whether that's through media partnerships, through other addressable audience data sets like Axiom or Epsilon or LiveRamp, for example, but also really figuring out how we're going to partner with our retailers as more of our investment starts to shift to the retail media networks and our overall mix of our marketing investments. I'd also say that, here at Kellogg, we are building digital marketing language and a foundational knowledge base across all of our marketers internally to help them to set the goals around data acquisition and how they can get to a better understanding of who their consumers and shoppers are. And then working through to drive a lot of governance around the activation of the data and the overall acquisition of that data that we're generating. So hopefully that gives a good flavor of kind of where we are and what we're starting to do to get ahead of this.
It's a tall order, Nicole, and it's a lot of different initiatives and prongs that you have going forward. You're all the way at education and stakeholders for everyone within the organization, but for companies who are just getting started, what would you say is kind of the first thing you should be paying attention to, and to be able to start that roadmap and roll out for people who aren't necessarily as far along?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to really understand your current state environment and how you're operating today. It's critical to look at your current marketing investments and really understand how much of that investment today is reliant on cookie-based targeting. In addition to that, start to unpack how much of your media investment is really in addressable channels. I think also it's critical to look at, how are you driving your first party data acquisition and strategy? How are you building your insight and audience capabilities around that? And then also really taking a look at how you're measuring the impact of your investments and what percentage of your investments are really going to be impacted by the loss of cookies. And then I think the last piece that's really, really critical as we're moving into, more identity resolution, more first party data sets and addressable audiences, but it's really, how is your company set up for success around the data privacy foundation that you're setting and how you're collecting and activating all of this data? Because if we think about just the regulatory environment today, it's critical that you have a lot of governance in place, processes and best practices to manage that data, but also to put consumers in control of how you're using their data to reach them as well.
Got it. Yeah, very important to get started and think about not only your investments and how to make them work harder, but future-proofing everything for regulatory and setting us up for success with the data infrastructure. So I'd love to kind of turn now to Lauren and hear a little bit more about your role at Kellogg and in this process, as well as, coming out of that expertise in your particular role, dealing with the tools and resources that might be able to help, and some of your learnings there, either good or bad, on what you found and what was useful and what wasn't when you started this future-proofing journey.
Sure. Hi, it's nice to meet you, Corinne. I'm Lauren Dubnow, and I have the pleasure of looking after global media partnerships and measurement here at Kellogg. In terms of tools and resources to get started, similar to Nicole's sentiment, I would say first and foremost is really, identifying a common language that everybody can speak to in terms of data-driven marketing and what does it mean, what is a data acquisition strategy, what is a global data governance model, et cetera. And then also understanding what is your operations model today, and how will it be impacted across the globe. So in setting that, that common language, really understanding what is it that's going to change so that we're prepared. And then the next step or next tool I'd say we created is a first-party data acquisition model that allows our marketers globally to identify growth targets in which they have the right to win based on different data attributes and different factors in each market, quite candidly. And then thirdly, I would say it's been really important to put together a business case in terms of having an owner of the consumer data strategy globally, and also data partnerships, so that you can ensure you're continually advancing those capabilities in terms of media planning, investment, audience strategy, measurements, and optimization. And then last but not least, when you work within such a large global organization with many stakeholders and marketers, just putting down those fundamentals on paper and creating trainings and playbooks and best practices that everybody can rally around and learn from and standardize that language from is really important.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we've evaluated how customer data fits in our infrastructure. We've laid out a strategy, and we've normalized it and done education for everyone in all of our stakeholders in our organization. Louise, I'd love to turn to you and learn a little bit more about your role at Kellogg, but also kind of where do we go from there? When we discuss this transformation piece, what does digital transformation look like for Kellogg right now? And how are you involved in that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a reason why there's 4 of us on this call. It's not simple, and we represent really the tip of the iceberg of what transformation really looks like. So my role within Kellogg is actually a new role, and it's reflective of the transformation that we need to go under. I sit in the commercial advanced analytics team in a global capacity, and our role is to really identify within marketing rapid use cases that we can run to quickly get learnings around how we use data technology to better inform our understanding of our consumer and shopper. And that really has to be at the heart of any transformation that you want to do. You're doing it in service of the consumer and shopper. You can transform for the sake of and chase shiny objects, and really it's never going to pay out. But if you've got a really clear understanding of your ambition, and our ambition is really about creating these personalized, inclusive experiences through the funnel, it really helps lead and guide your transformation. But digital transformation has to be holistic. We talk a lot about the maturity of our markets and making sure that we move sequentially as a group. There's no point over investing in technology when you've got no way of activating against it. There's no point acquiring a lot of 1P data if you've got no way of activating it. No point having grand dreams of personalization if you've got no 1P data. So it's really about making sure you move holistically, but also making sure that you constantly test and learn as you go through it. Education and training, as Lauren touched on, is really important, and from the top down as well. Marketing is about to go through this massive transformation, and it's understandable that perhaps our senior leaders aren't as up to speed as maybe some of our other members of our teams, and so top down and bottom up transformation and education is absolutely critical in that journey.
Yeah. Interesting. So with this rapid iteration and the bottoms up, informing the bottoms up, Paul, I think I'd love to direct a question for you about a little bit more about the top down. Everything's changing all the time, and it seems like your job to really stay on top of that and know what it is and be able to make these predictions and ensure that your strategies are future forward without maybe having run some of those rapid fire experience or without the benefit of having data because it's all new. So how do you do that and align with the changing landscape and stay on top of it along with your role at Kellogg?
Yeah, great question. So you nailed it. There is constant change. That is the one thing that we can certainly count on, especially in these spaces. My role at Kellogg is working on data strategy, and a lot of what I'm focused on specifically right now is curating, growing, and realizing value from activation of our first-party database. So we definitely rely on strategies that are future-proofed as we go forward. But at Kellogg, we're really focused on top-tier performance. And so we have a number of strategies that sit beneath that top-tier performance. And we call them our growth boosters. So those growth boosters are winning through occasions, building world-class brands, shaping a growth portfolio, delivering perfect service and store, and people must be our competitive advantage. So those are consistent throughout the entire organization, which Kellogg, like many CPGs, is quite large. So that consistency is very key. Having clarity that they're understood throughout the organization is also very key. When you have that clarity and understanding everywhere in the organization, it really makes it easy to weather the changing landscape because the landscape is going to change. That we can guarantee. So that's how we approach it.
Yeah, I can even tell on this call how aligned and singing from the same songbook everyone at Kellogg is. So certainly the education piece is more important than I realized in the beginning, because you can absolutely see the results of that. So Lauren, if Louise is saying this has to be holistic and there's no point in gathering this first party data unless you can activate on it, how do you work in tandem with her team to activate on that first party data? How can brands tap into it and build better strategies to attract consumers?
Sure, that's a great question. And I'd say first and foremost is really setting up and unlocking those enablers that allow you to acquire first party data. And those range from, putting into place the right operating model, having everybody sit down and agree to what the data strategy is going to be. Again, building that ad and MarTech infrastructure, and then putting a clear process in place to activate upon the data that everybody in the organization, from legal to media to your partners, are comfortable with. And then once that's all in place, really thinking through that value exchange that's going to resonate with your consumers and shoppers throughout their path to purchase and in their basic day of their life, right? That makes them want to interact with you maybe on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And it's just so important that value exchange is not only relates to them, but is dynamic, right? So that it can change over time as our relationship changes with our consumers and shoppers, but also as their needs change. So those are really I'd say the key areas that we think about and we've been working on as we talk about acquiring and activating first party data.
Right. Great. And how do you get a sense of that value exchange? How, like Paul mentioned, everything's changing all the time. So how do you get those signals of value for what's valuable to customers and through measurement, understanding a little bit more about that and keeping on top of it?
Sure. I'd say Paul's actually probably the perfect person to speak to about this right now, and I'll let him chime in a second. But I would say, it really takes a good test and learn strategy to see what works and what doesn't work and resonates with different groups of consumers and shoppers, so that and really drilling into those core data signals to understand their purchase behavior, their interests, their attitudes, what it is that moves them on a day-to-day basis. But if you could start there and then implement a test and learn strategy to see different types of value, to test different types of value exchanges, then you can, from a measurement standpoint, begin to see what really works. But Paul, I would swing it over to you to see if you have anything to build there.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on the keys. I mean, obviously, the consumers are looking for experiences that fit into their lives. So, you're constantly testing and learning to find out, how you could get there and how you can execute those. So, I think you covered it quite well.
I would add to that as well. It's not a one size fits all approach. Depending on what you want to acquire and who you want to acquire, it's not just a kind of like, you'll always give data in exchange for this. Different audiences want different things from your brand, and exactly as Paul said, to fit into their lives or add value to their lives. And it's rarely a one size fits all. What you give in exchange is what you'll get back. So if you want people who are loyalists to your brand, offering money can't buy experiences is fantastic. But to someone who doesn't know your brand, that doesn't really mean anything to them yet. And so you've got to be really considerate about who you're trying to acquire in terms of value exchange that you're offering.
Right. We've seen what matters to consumers change dramatically over the last 2 years. How are you, Louise, thinking about the next two? You mentioned setting up vision, using the iterative test and learn, but how are you setting up marketing and digital transformation for the next 2 to 3 years? Keeping an eye to that change in either a sweeping change that you've seen of things that are around to stay for consumer behavior, or just planning out for the future and just trying to stay ahead of it?
Yeah, I mean, that change is going to be rapid. I think the way we do marketing today is not how we're going to be doing it in 5 years' time. And that's going to be driven by what the consumer expects of us. The consumer is going to expect us to understand who they are. And they're not going to really care that for someone like a CPG brand like us, we don't have that last mile transaction. We don't know when they last bought us. They're not going to care whether they expect the same level of personalization as they get from MasterCard or Nordstrom or anyone. They don't give us that privilege of kind of saying, well, you don't know that. They expect that. And so we're really going to be driven about how the consumer's expectations change over time. I think one of the biggest areas we're focused on, and certainly that's in my role, is how AI and machine learning will improve our understanding of consumers. How will it help us generate more accurate, more granular insights? How will it help us create personalized content at scale? And how will it help us measure both the short term and the long term without us compromising on the two? We take very much historically a broad brush approach, and that is the biggest transformation that's going to happen for us with these personalized experiences. But they have to be done in a way that's commercially viable and also is additive to the consumer's life, everything that Paul said. So, that's really where we're heading to. When we look back and we kind of say, oh, I made 4 ads a year for Pringles, people will kind of go, 4? I make 400, and so right. It's going to be a very different space that we're leaning into, and that's what the consumer wants from us.
Yeah. So, one-to-one marketing at one point was kind of a far-flung fantasy, and everyone said, oh, AI is going to make this happen. Are we really at a point where we have meaningfully workable AI, Paul, and how confident are you in that, and as well as, you know, the next 2 to 3 years, how it's going to change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of people talk about AI constantly. I would say AI, ML, I mean, they're only as good as the data that you have. And so it is capable and certainly able, but it really, what you've heard us talk about, it really relies upon the data that you have. So we're spending a lot of that foundational time making sure that we have the right data. We're enriching that data, analyzing that data correctly, so that it can enable and unlock what AI can do.
Right. And what advice would you have for brands to better leverage data to better reach their customers, or common mistakes you think can make, or common mistakes that can be made, big learnings you've had? Like, when we say, let's, you know, garbage in, garbage out, let's start with a good foundation and use of that data. What are some advice you might have for people watching on what that means in practice?
Yeah, I don't think there are any mistakes. There are learning opportunities in a space like this that's constantly changing. So I think the only mistake you can make is not moving forward. So, you know, essentially, as I mentioned, consumers are really looking for personalized experiences. And what do I mean by that, right? I mean, they're looking for communications that they receive from a brand to add value. So, you know, really, rather than the old days of being interrupted, you know, they really want you to bring value to them. And you know, how do you build that relationship with them so that you can add value? Requires that you have data to be able to understand that individual and you know, tailor the messaging and targeting. So I'll just talk a little bit quickly about 3 spaces that we are using data to do things like that. So the first one is just simply like purchase-based data. So, I mean, if you know, either from, you know, loyalty card or panel or receipt uploads or anything in that purchase-based capture, if a person has bought your product recently, you know, or they have never bought it, or they've stopped buying it. I mean, I think the interruption that you see a lot of times is not having a good view on, did somebody already buy this product? I mean, stop sending them the message to buy the product if they've already done it. You know, that is a key of having that purchase-based view to provide value when they need it. The other one is really, you know, moving beyond just purchase-based to really have attitudinal and behavioral data, so that you can really understand the consumer and shopper's motivations. Why did they buy it? Why did they not buy it? You know, with that understanding, you can really start to look at what the barriers might be for why they haven't bought it, and how can you overcome those. And then I think the last one that I'll talk about is just like, you know, eliminating friction is adding value to a consumer, right? So what we've done is basically adding buy now, whether it's a Micmac integration at the end of an ad, click through, whatever that might be, but you know, allowing the individual to be able to get that product much more seamlessly and on their terms as we move forward. So those are kind of 3 areas that I would give advice on, but there are no mistakes. You're gonna have learning opportunities all along the way. But
Yeah.
Love that. So there are no mistakes, but there are stakeholders who may notice those mistakes. Louise, how do you do it? How do you convince people like me that AI is an accessible component in the toolbox now? How do you push these things through?
Yeah, you can't do this unless you've got top-down support. There are a lot of impediments to making this successful. High cost of entry, you know, with some of the technology, lack of access to certain data unless you buy it, unproven results within your own company. And so there's a lot of reasons, and easy to say no. So you have to get top-down buy-in. And what you also have to have is, you know, and I didn't touch on it before, one of the big things about this digital transformation is the reduction in silos. There's always historically been silos in marketing, whether it's, you know, brand team, experience, e-commerce, shopper, but those silos, they have to be eradicated. And also we have to eradicate silos between supply chain and technology and everything like that. So when you talk about how you get that stakeholder engagement, you have to have your CMO, your CIO, and your head of insights absolutely in lockstep creating the plan together, because they are the ones who will drive that transformation, and they'll drive that transformation that's holistic across the board. If you just go in one direction, you'll pull too far in one guy, you'll be too technology heavy and it's not moving at the right maturity. But when they're in lockstep, the whole organization can move forward as one, because you're going to generate value to the business across insights, activation, and measurement. And so that's where you really want to drive that stakeholder alignment and engagement.
Yeah, I think one other thing I would just add to Lou, what you said, is it's also really critical that you are approaching this as a very agile test and learn sort of innovation mindset, right? And so I think one of the key messages that we're also driving across the organization is this curiosity and experimentation mindset. And I think also with that, it allows sort of more of the freedom to fail fast and pivot. But also being able to carve out the dollars that you need to truly drive the test and learn at a far faster pace than maybe historically we've ever done that before. And if you think about kind of a company like Kellogg, right, we're a 116-plus-year-old company. And so when you're trying to sort of move at the speed of change, and different planning cycles don't always allow for us to be, as agile. So we're truly having to kind of break down a lot of functional silos, rethink the way in which we budget and invest in some of these things. And then how do we really protect those innovation dollars so that we can test and learn at scale and then scale faster?
Yeah, and I'd say on that as well, the pursuit of perfection is a fool's errand on this journey. If you try to get everything set up just perfectly, it won't work. And so you have to go with these, exactly what Nicole said, these small tests. And we do these kind of 90-day projects. And if they can't be completed in 90 days, it's not the right test for us. And so it's in and out, it's light footprint. If it works, we've set very clear KPIs on what it means to scale. But if it doesn't work, we leave a minimal footprint and minimal impact onto the business. And that's a constant cycle of what we're doing across marketing all the time.
That's great. We definitely have some compliments in the chat on Kellogg's ability to structure and de-silo in a way that makes this all possible. I'd love to turn to some of those Q&As now, if that works. One of them is about evaluating and authenticating solution providers to maintain reach and evaluate performance. There's a lot of questions here about tools and what particularly can you use. People are throwing out names of certain vendors, and how you deal with the outsourcing versus what you're doing yourself on media activation. So I don't know if who wants to maybe take this.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and then I'll turn it over to Paul to kind of contribute to what we're sort of doing in the US. I think that, from a Kellogg perspective, we are at varying degrees of maturity around the globe. And so, as we've been digging into different identity resolution solutions, as we look at sort of LiveRamp and Epsilon and Retargetly and some of all these other kind of capabilities out there, there isn't what we've found so far as a one size fits all in a specific partner. And I think that has to do a lot with the data availability and the size of the audience data sets that we're able to access and rent, if you will. And so I think that, the approach that we've been taking is let's learn from the markets that are more mature. Let's figure out different capabilities and tools and partners that can deliver the use cases that we have. And then continue to sort of start to build our recommendation for that longer term roadmap that might have more scalability for us over time. Paul, any builds from your side there?
Yeah, I think just to build on the consistent theme we were talking about with test and learn, right? So in the US, we certainly are not just picking one and going forward with it. We're actually trying a number of different ones, blending them in different use cases, So, I would just encourage anybody that's in the space to really find out what works best for you and your organization and your data and your consumers, because, it does kind of depend on individual use cases. So coming up with your recipe takes some test and learn.
Great. There is one more question that's not about essentially who are using and is there a single ID, which most people want to know, about a customer data management platform. I think it's more of a general question for people for brands who are getting interested in using CDPs, and any tips or advice on how you're looking at your individual customer data platform and how that fits within your overall infrastructure. Any advice there from things that you've learned?
Yeah, this is a big topic, I think, internally for us. I think that, a CDP for us is certainly on our roadmap. But I think that the approaches that we're taking today are really more use case based, and really trying to understand, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the desired outcomes? How do we drive the insights? How do we do the activation? How do we measure the impact of those activities? And so I think that it's something that we are continuing to explore, but really, I think defining sort of the specific role that it's going to play in our overall solution and ecosystem is still a little bit yet to be determined. But I don't know, Lou or Paul, any other thoughts from you?
Yeah, Lou, if you want to go.
Go for it.
You want me to go for okay? Yeah, no, I agree with Nicole. It's definitely an area that we have a lot of conversation on. One of the things that I'll say is that different regions across the globe have different regulations, different needs. So it does make it good to have a very in-depth conversation when you're trying to do something organizationally across all these regions, because there are some things in the US that we can do that others regions can't do, and vice versa. But honestly, we're again taking a bit of a test and learn approach, and what we don't have a defined CDP in place right now. We have all of the pieces in place, and our testing weighs in before we kind of go with one provider moving forward. So we'll see what that looks like.
Yeah, I was just going to add, going back to my earlier point, based on your maturity, as Nicole said, it's on the roadmap, but we've got to be ready to use it. There's no point having it and then just start activating against it. It's a very hefty investment. And so we have to be sure that our markets, our regions, our teams are upskilled, they've got the data, they're able to activate against and have a need to be able to use it. And so it's on the roadmap at the right point when we hit that right maturity to get there. So that would be my advice. Make sure your organization is ready to use it.
And that you've determined the operating model behind it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's also so important in this entire conversation, which is, what are you going to outsource to your agency partners versus what are you going to do internally, and who has access to all this information as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, you guys. I have one more question to throw into the mix, if you guys don't mind. So for brands that sell their products across multiple retailers, how should they be thinking about future-proofing their first and third-party data strategies?
Oh man, that's a big question. I think that when we talk to our brands internally, it's a combination of first and third party, right? I think that until you have just such a massive data set that's first party, you're always going to need to rely on third party partners as well. I think the big piece with, our retailers and the point of transaction for us is our retailers can provide a lot of great data for us. They can provide great information on the buying behaviors of our consumers and shoppers. They can also help provide us to better real-time sales signals on how we're performing. But I think that it's really important to think about, the overall data partnerships and retail media networks and the role that they're going to play. Versus some of your other data sets and data that you have access to, right? Because obviously more and more data is becoming more readily available. But it's like, how do you size the value that data set brings to you? And is it truly incremental to other data sets that you already have? And so I think that data strategy is what is so critical to really define where you have gaps and where you can close those gaps through these different partnerships.